Not every day, every single evening. The same corner of the backyard, beneath the oldest oak on the property, facing the same direction, from the moment the light began to fail until full dark settled over the land. He did not pace. He did not whine. He simply sat and watched something that no one else could see. And when the night became complete, he would rise slowly, walk back to the porch, and sleep as though nothing unusual had occurred. The neighbors on Callaway Road had grown so accustomed to it that they had stopped mentioning it entirely. Harriet Dobbs, who lived across the field and could see the oak from her kitchen window, told her daughter it was the most reliably strange thing she had ever witnessed. Every evening, never missed. Winter, summer, rain that drove grown adults inside. The dog sat. His name was Colt. He was a border collie, black and white, with a left ear that had never quite stood straight and a scar along his right shoulder from an incident that predated the current owners by years. He was 12 years old when Marin and her husband Joel first moved into the property on Callaway Road, which meant the behavior had started roughly at the age of 1, or possibly before that, back when a different family lived in this house and a different set of hands had planted the garden that now ran wild along the eastern fence. Nobody who gave Colt to Marin told her about the evenings. She found out the way you find out about most things with dogs, which is by watching, and by not understanding what you're watching for long enough that eventually the watching itself becomes a kind of answer. She had been living in the house for 3 weeks when she first noticed it. Joel was traveling for work. She was alone in a house that still smelled like other people's furniture, sitting on the porch with a mug of tea gone cold in her hands, watching the yard go dark. That was when Colt stood up from where he had been lying near the door, walked with slow deliberation across the yard, and settled into the far corner beneath the oak as though he had an appointment there. Marin watched him for a long time without moving. She told herself it was nothing. A dog being a dog. Some animals return to the same places out of habit, out of some encoded territorial logic that humans interpret as personality, but is really just pattern. She had read that somewhere, or something like it. She told herself that, but Colt was not sniffing the ground. He was not rolling in anything. He was not watching for squirrels or rabbits or the faint rustling in the hedgerow that dogs fixate on for reasons no one fully understands. He was sitting perfectly still, facing slightly east of north, watching something at approximately the height of where a standing person's face would be. There was nothing there. Marin went inside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him from behind the glass until the yard was too dark to see him clearly. When she went upstairs to bed, she looked out the bedroom window. She could just make out the pale patch of his chest in the darkness, still there, still facing the same direction. In the morning, she found him asleep on the porch mat as though nothing had happened. The next evening, she watched again, and the evening after that. And by the end of the first month, she had stopped pretending this was normal dog behavior, even as she remained unable to explain what it was instead. What she did not know yet, and would not know for another 4 months, was that the man who had loved this dog was buried in a cemetery 20 minutes from this house, and that the corner of the yard where Colt sat every evening was the exact place where that man had died. The property had belonged to a man named Reed Callaway. Not a relative of the road, just a coincidence of name that the county records confirmed without comment. Reed had owned the 5-acre parcel for 16 years before his death, the last 2 of which he had spent alone following his wife's departure, and the last 6 months of which he had spent in what his doctors described as managed decline and what Reed himself apparently described, according to his neighbor Harriet, as the inconvenience of dying on a schedule. He had been 61 years old. He had died of a cardiac event, alone in the backyard, at approximately 6 in the evening on a Thursday in October. Colt had been with him. This information came to Marin gradually, the way information comes in small towns, which is through neighbors who bring casseroles and mention things sideways and watch your face while they mention them. Harriet came over first. She was a wide woman in her 70s with a directness that Marin found immediately comfortable, and she sat at Marin's kitchen table and said that Reed Calloway had been her neighbor for 15 years and that she missed him in a way she was still not entirely accustomed to. She told Marin about the evenings without Marin having to ask. She had seen Marin watching Colt from the porch and figured she deserved to know what she had inherited along with the house. Reed was a man who repaired things, Harriet said. Not professionally, just by disposition. He fixed his own fences, his own roof, his own machinery, and when his neighbors had something that needed fixing, he had a way of appearing with the right tools before you'd properly finished describing the problem. That was how she had known him first. Her porch railing had given way in a winter storm, and before she had made 3 calls, Reed had been there with lumber and a level and a thermos of coffee. He was a forester by trade, she said, which accounted for the property. He had chosen this particular parcel because of the soil and the tree coverage and a spring-fed pond in the northeast corner that appeared on no county maps he could find. He had told Harriet once that the first time he walked this land, he had known within 20 minutes he was going to buy it. Some places are like that, he had said. They tell you. He and his wife Cecile had moved onto the property when Willa was 3 years old. Harriet had watched the girl grow up from across the field, watched her ride a bicycle too large for her up and down the road and catch crawfish in the pond and follow her, father through the woods with the absolute trust that children have in their parents before they begin to understand that parents are also people. That phase lasts about 10 years, Harriet said. Some families navigate the end of it well. Some don't. She did not say more than that about how it had gone for the Calloways. She looked at her coffee again. What she did say was that Cecile had left 4 years before Reed died, which was not unexpected if you had been watching, which Harriet had been. The marriage had been going quiet for years, the way some marriages go quiet without anyone deciding to make them so, until one day the quiet was the hole in it. Cecile had moved to the coast. They had not divorced because neither of them had apparently found the energy for it, but the separation had been real and complete. Reed had been left with the property and the dog, and the particular silence of a house that had once held more life than it currently held. Willa was 27 when her mother left, and 28 when she stopped speaking to her father. Harriet did not know the precise reason and had not asked, because there are things neighbors understand are not theirs to know. But she knew it had something to do with something Reed had done, or had not done, or had said in the months after Cecile's departure, during a period when Reed had not been his best self. That was how Harriet described it, not his best self. As though his best self still existed and was simply elsewhere temporarily, which perhaps it was. What she knew for certain was that one day Willa stopped returning his calls. Then she stopped answering them. Then the birthday cards Reed sent came back unopened, and he stopped sending them. And after that, the silence between them had the formal quality of a decision rather than just a distance. Reed raised Colt from a pup, Harriet said. That dog went everywhere with him. When Reed got sick, Colt didn't leave the property for 4 months. Nobody had to tie him. He just didn't leave. She paused here. She looked at her coffee. The evening Reed died, Harriet had seen it from her kitchen window, she said. Not what happened, because she hadn't understood what she was seeing. Just Reed standing under that oak, and Colt beside him, and then Reed not standing anymore. She had called an ambulance. By the time they arrived, Reed was gone. Colt had stayed in that corner of the yard for 3 days after that. The animal control officer who came to collect him had to carry him, because Colt would not walk away from that spot on his own. Marin was quiet for a long time, after Harriet said this. She asked what happened to Colt after Reed died. "A county shelter," Harriet said. 12 days. Then a family took him, but it didn't last. He wouldn't settle. He kept running back to this property, and they kept finding him at the fence line. After the second time, they brought him back to the shelter. After the third time, they surrendered him. He was there for 5 months when the county listed him as available for adoption as part of a property sale. So he came with the house, Marin said. Not officially, Harriet said, but in every way that matters. Marin looked out the kitchen window toward the yard. The oak was visible from where she sat, its canopy still holding most of its leaves in the autumn light. She asked if Reed had any family. Harriet considered this carefully, in the way that people consider things when the accurate answer requires more care than the simple answer. He had a daughter, Harriet said, Willa. They weren't speaking when Reed died. Hadn't been for about 3 years. She came for the funeral but didn't stay, and as far as Harriet knew, she hadn't been back. Marin nodded. She didn't ask anything else. She thought about Reed in his last 6 months, on a property he had chosen, because it had told him something the first time he walked it, sitting under the oak each evening, with a dog who did not leave and a daughter who had. She thought about what it costs a person to hold 2 things at once, the life they built and the life they damaged. How a person can love a place and still feel it as an indictment. That should have been the end of the conversation. Just a sad story about a man and his dog, and an estrangement that had never been repaired. The kind of grief that settles into properties and outlasts the people who made it. But it wasn't the end. Because 2 weeks after Harriet's visit, Colt did something he had never done before. He started digging. It began small enough that Marin almost missed it. A shallow depression at the base of the oak, barely 6 inches deep, as though he had started and then reconsidered. She filled it in. The next morning it was open again, slightly deeper. She filled it again. The next morning deeper still, and Colt was there when she came out, and he looked at her in a way that she could not name, but also could not dismiss, and he went back to the depression and pawed at it twice. Marin stood in the yard in her coat and looked at him. She had owned dogs before. She knew how this was supposed to work. Dogs dug in yards because they smelled rodents, because they wanted to bury things, because the ground was soft and digging felt satisfying, because of any number of reasons that had nothing to do with intention or meaning, or the kind of looks that this dog was giving her. She knew that. She told herself that. She called Joel that night and told him what was happening, and Joel said it was probably a mole, and she agreed and then lay awake for 2 hours thinking about the way Colt had looked at her. The digging continued. By the end of the 3rd week, the depression at the base of the oak was 18 inches deep and nearly 2 feet across, and Colt was scratching at the sides with a focused persistence that had moved past habit into something that Marin found increasingly difficult to categorize. He ate his meals. He slept normally. He was, by any observable measure, a healthy and well-functioning dog. But the digging was different from anything she had seen a dog do, and she had seen dogs dig for most of her adult life. She took him to the vet, not because she thought the digging was a symptom of illness, but because she needed someone else to look at him and tell her what they saw, and because the vet clinic in town was run by a woman named Dr. Felice Stroud, who had been practicing for 22 years and who had a reputation, Harriet had told her, for being honest about animals in ways that were not always comfortable, but were always accurate. Dr. Stroud examined Colt thoroughly and found nothing wrong with him. Joints healthy, heart clear, vision and hearing both functional for a dog his age. She asked Marin to describe the behavior, and Marin described it carefully, and Dr. Stroud listened without interrupting and asked several specific questions about the timing, the location, and Colt's demeanor, both before and after the digging. Then she sat on a stool in the exam room and looked at Colt for a long moment. She said that scent-driven digging in dogs typically bore the hallmarks of urgency or agitation. The dog was tracking something that was moving or had recently moved, and the dig was a chase. What Marin was describing sounded different, systematic, oriented. She used the word patient, which Marin found interesting given that it was not a word she typically associated with dogs engaged in physical work. She said she had read papers on trained cadaver dogs, returning repeatedly to internment sites. She said she had also read papers on dogs, demonstrating localized behavioral changes around objects that held strong scent associations with deceased owners. She said these were different phenomena, and she was not saying Colt was exhibiting either one. She was saying she had no simple explanation for what Marin was describing. She looked at Marin. She said, "How long has this property been in the family you bought it from?" Marin said, "It had one owner. He died there. His dog was Colt." Dr. Stroud was quiet for a moment. She said, "Then I would follow where he's pointing." She said it the way she might say anything else, plainly, without emphasis. But Marin drove home with those words arranged in a different configuration in her mind than the one in which they had been delivered. Follow where he is pointing. As though Colt were a compass whose dial had been set by something she couldn't see and couldn't argue with. She called Joel that evening and told him about the vet appointment. There was a silence on his end that was longer than usual. He said, "I'll come home this weekend." She said, "You don't need to." He said, "I want to." She did not argue with him. She did not say that she was not frightened, because she was not sure that was entirely true. She was not frightened of Colt. She was not frightened of the hole. She was frightened in the particular way of someone who has started to suspect that a thing is real before they have evidence for it, of what finding the answer might mean. Not just for her. For whoever came after her in the chain of people, this story was apparently not finished with yet. She hung up and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard. Colt was in the corner beneath the oak. The evening was failing in the ordinary way of evenings in November, the light going gray and then going less. He was sitting the way he always sat, still and directed, facing slightly east of north. She watched him for a long time. She was thinking about the word Harriet had used, estrangement. She was thinking about what it costs a person to be unable to say a thing directly, and what that unsaid thing costs the person it was meant for, and how sometimes the only way a silence can be broken is from outside of it, by someone who does not yet know what the silence contains. She thought about this while the dark came in. She called Harriet. Harriet came over the next morning, walked to the base of the oak, looked at the hole, looked at Colt, and was quiet for a moment. She said, "Reed used to sit here." Marin said she knew. Harriet said, "He used to sit here, especially in the last year, more than anywhere else on the property. He had a chair he'd drag out when the weather was decent. Just sat, thinking," he said, when Harriet asked him what he was doing. "Just thinking." She paused again. "He had a box," Harriet said. "A metal box, the kind you'd use for documents or small valuables. I saw him with it once. He was sitting under the tree, and he had it in his hands, and he was just holding it, hadn't opened it. Just holding it like it weighed something. I never asked him what was inside." Marin looked at the hole. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she was now standing in someone else's yard, with someone else's dog, staring at a hole that the dog had been insisting on for weeks, and that whatever was in that hole had been there for at least 11 years and possibly longer, and that a man had died in this exact spot, and a dog had been sitting here every evening since, and had now, with no discernible trigger, started digging. She thought all of this. She did not say it. She said, "I think I need to keep digging." Harriet looked at her. Then she looked at Colt. Then she said, "I think you're right." Joel drove back that weekend. He was skeptical in the way that practical men are skeptical, which is not dismissive exactly, but weighted toward the explanation that requires the fewest unusual assumptions. He pointed out that animals bury things, that some breeds are particularly driven by scent and the memory of buried objects, and that a border collie who had lived on this property for over a decade would have any number of reasons to dig in a familiar spot. Marin did not argue with him. She simply asked him to dig with her. He did. They worked in the late afternoon, taking turns, the soil cold and dense under the spade. Joel started. He had the methodical patience of someone who had spent years in work that required physical precision, and he approached the hole the same way, clearing dirt from the edges first, keeping the walls clean. Marin took her turns when he tired, and neither of them spoke much. Colt sat at the edge of the hole, watching them with an attention that Joel found increasingly hard to dismiss as they went deeper. At 14 inches, they found nothing. At 20 inches, they found nothing. The light was going, and Marin had brought a flashlight from the house, and she held it over the hole while Joel dug, and the beam caught the dark of the turned earth and the pale of the roots and nothing else. At 26 inches, Joel's shovel struck something that was not dirt and not rock. He stopped. He looked at Marin. She crouched at the edge of the hole. He cleared around it carefully. The ground was dark and compact at this depth, and the thing took some time to unearth. When he finally lifted it free and set it on the grass, it was exactly what Harriet had described: a metal box. Rectangular, roughly the size of a large book, painted a dark green that had oxidized unevenly. A combination lock, 3 wheels, the kind that could be set to any 4-digit number. The metal was dirty but solid. It had been sealed against moisture with a thin bead of weather stripping along the lid. Colt came forward and sniffed it once. Then he stepped back and sat down and looked at Marin. The 3 of them looked at the box for a long time. Joel set his hand flat on the lid, not to open it, just resting there. He looked up at Marin. He said quietly, "Someone put this here on purpose." She said, "I know." He said, "And they're gone." She said, "Yes." He looked at the box again. The yard was almost fully dark now, the oak above them just a shape against the lighter dark of the sky. Somewhere across the field, Harriet's kitchen window was a lit square. The combination, Joel said finally. "We don't know it." Marin was quiet. She was thinking about Harriet's description of Reed sitting under this tree in the last year of his life, holding the box without opening it, just holding it like it weighed something. She thought about the daughter, Willa, who had come to the funeral and not stayed and had not been back. She thought about the word that Harriet had used without quite using it: estrangement, the particular weight of that word, the thing it describes, which is not just distance, but the kind of distance that used to be closeness, and the specific grief of that. She thought about what you put in a box that you cannot bring yourself to open. She reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. There was something loose inside, something that moved slightly when she tilted the box, a soft sliding weight. She turned the first combination wheel to 0 and then stopped. She looked at Joel. She said, "We need to find the daughter first." Willa Calloway was 34 years old and lived in a city 4 hours north of Calloway Road. She had a website for her ceramics work, which is how Marin found her, and a business inquiry email address that Marin used to send a message that she spent 2 hours writing and rewrote 4 times before sending. She did not say she had found something. She did not say anything about the box, because she felt instinctively that information delivered without context could go wrong in ways she could not predict. She said only that she had recently moved into the house on Calloway Road, and that she had some things she thought Willa should know, and that she hoped Willa would be willing to speak with her. She sent it on a Sunday evening. Willa replied on Monday morning, within the hour. The reply was brief and the tone was careful in a way that Marin recognized. The careful tone of someone who has been managing grief for a long time and has gotten very good at keeping it at a controlled distance. She said she appreciated Marin reaching out and asked what things Marin had wanted to discuss. They spoke on the phone that evening. Marin had planned what she would say, and then did not say it that way at all, because Willa's voice was not what she had expected, and the conversation that resulted was not what she had planned. Willa's voice was measured and quiet, but there was something underneath it that Marin recognized from the outside because she had felt it from the inside before, which was the sound of a person who has been holding something for so long that they have forgotten what holding nothing felt like. Marin told her about Colt first. She did not lead with the box. She described the evenings, the sitting, the precise location beneath the oak. She described it carefully because she wanted Willa to understand that whatever Marin was about to tell her next was not trivial. There was a long silence on Willa's end. Then Willa said, "He was always under that oak." Marin said yes. Willa said, "When I was a kid, that was where he used to read. He had a folding chair he kept in the shed, and in the evenings in summer, he would drag it out and sit under the tree with a book and a beer, and he would read until he couldn't see anymore. I used to sit on the porch and watch him. I thought that was the most boring thing I'd ever seen a grown person do. I was maybe 8. She paused. I would give a lot to be able to watch him do that again, she said. Marin waited. Then she told Willa about the digging. She described it the same way, carefully, without editorializing. Colt returning to the spot, the hole deepening, the way he had looked at her. And then she said, "We found something buried there." The silence this time was different. "A box," Marin said. "Metal, green, with a combination lock." She heard Willa exhale. She heard very distinctly the sound of a person sitting down. The silence stretched for a moment that Marin did not fill. She had learned, in the course of her own life, that some silences need to run their length before the next thing can happen. This was one of those silences. It had weight and shape. It was the silence of a person reconsidering a distance they had been maintaining for years, and finding that the ground on the other side had changed while they were looking away. Willa said, "I know what combination he would have used." Marin said nothing. "A date," Willa said. "He used dates for everything. And there was only one date he would have used for something like that." She said the date. She said it without hesitation. Marin wrote it down. She asked Willa if she wanted to be there when they opened it. Another silence, long, the kind that is not emptiness but the opposite of emptiness. "Yes," Willa said. After the call ended, Marin sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The box was in front of her. She had brought it inside after Joel unearthed it, wiped it down, and set it on the table where it had sat for 4 days. She had not touched the combination wheels. It had not felt like hers to open. She looked at it now in the particular way you look at something that has been waiting longer than you have been alive. She thought about Ride sitting above this box every evening for however many years he had lived after sealing it, which was something she calculated now for the first time. If Colt had started the behavior at approximately age 1, and the digging had started 11 years after the owner's death, and the behavior had preceded the owner's death by some uncertain period, then Reed had put this box in the ground when Colt was young. Perhaps in the year of the estrangement. Perhaps in the year after, when the birthday cards came back unopened, and he had to make some decision about what to do with the things he could not bring himself to throw away, but could not bear to hold in his hands anymore. She thought about that. A man who could not open a box he had made and could not destroy it, and so had buried it in the ground beneath the tree where he spent his evenings, so that he could sit above it and know it was there, the way you know certain things are there, intact and preserved, even when you cannot look at them directly. She looked at Colt. He was lying near the door, watching her with the patient attention that she had come to recognize as his baseline. Not anxious, not insistent, just present in the way he was always present, as though waiting was something he had made peace with a long time ago. She thought, he waited 11 years for someone to live in this house who would actually look at him. That thought landed in her with a weight she had not expected. She went to bed and did not sleep well, and in the morning she called Harriet and told her Willa was coming on Saturday. And Harriet was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good, that is good." She drove down the following Saturday. She arrived in the early afternoon when the light was flat and gray and the oak cast no shadow. She was tall like her father, Harriet said afterward, and she had his eyes and his way of going quiet before saying something important. She had driven 4 hours alone. Marin had offered in a text the night before to meet her somewhere closer to make the distance shorter. Willa had replied, "I want to come to the house. I haven't been back since the funeral. I think it's time." Marin had read that message 3 times. When Willa pulled into the driveway, she sat in her car for a moment before getting out. Marin watched from the window without pretending she wasn't watching. Willa looked at the yard first. Not the house, the yard. She looked at the oak specifically, and Marin could see, even at that distance, something move through her face. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Something more like recognition. The way a person looks at a place that still contains a version of their life that no longer exists. Then she got out of the car and came to the door. Marin had the box on the kitchen table when Willa arrived. Colt came to the door when Willa knocked, and when Willa stepped inside, he went very still and then pressed his nose against her hand, and Willa bent down and put her forehead against his and did not move for a long moment. Nobody said anything. There are moments where the correct thing to say is nothing. When Willa straightened up, her eyes were wet, but her face was controlled, in the particular way of people who have learned to be controlled because the alternative was once too costly. She looked at Colt for another moment. Then she looked at Marin. She said, "He smells the same. They must carry their owners in their coats somehow." She said it simply, without ornamentation, and it landed in the room with the weight of something true. They sat at the kitchen table. Joel stood by the window. Harriet had asked if she could be there, and no one had said no. Willa looked at the box for a long time without touching it. It sat between them on the table, weathered and oxidized and solid. Whatever it had cost Reed Calloway to seal this box and put it in the ground, it was here now, and whatever it had cost him to not be able to open it, that cost was paid in full. She looked at the combination lock. She said he set this to a date. My birthday, I think. I always thought he used my birthday for things, but never said so. We had a running joke that his passwords were terrible because he used obvious numbers. He would deny it, and then I'd find out I was right. She said this without looking away from the box. It was not a sad thing the way she said it. It was the kind of memory that is both tender and unbearable because the person it belongs to is not there to confirm it. She reached out and set the combination. 4 digits. A date that Marin did not ask about. The lock opened with a clean click. Willa lifted the lid. Inside was a letter, handwritten on 3 sheets of folded paper. A small photograph, creased at the corner, showing a much younger Reed and a girl of about 10 at what appeared to be the coast, both of them squinting into the sun and laughing at something off camera. A thin gold ring that had belonged to Willa's mother. And beneath all of it, a birthday card still in its envelope, sealed, with Willa's name written on the front in her father's handwriting. The card had a date written in the corner of the envelope, the year of the estrangement. A year things had broken between them, in some way that Reed had apparently not been able to repair while he was living. Willa looked at the date for a long time before she picked up the card. She looked at the photograph first. She held it in both hands, and her face did something that Marin could not fully read and did not try to. Then she set it down carefully and picked up the ring and held it in her palm without closing her fist around it, just letting it rest there, feeling its weight. She looked at the letter, but did not open it. Not yet. She picked up the card. Willa picked it up and held it in both hands for a long moment. She did not open it immediately. She held it the way Harriet had once seen Reed hold this box, like something that weighed more than its physical weight. There was a quality to the silence in the room at this point that Marin would think about for a long time afterward. It was not the silence of people holding their breath. It was something more like the silence of a thing completing itself. The way a sound has a shape that can only be understood once it is finished, and you realize it was not random, it was a word. Then she opened it. Marin did not read what it said. Neither did Joel or Harriet. That was not theirs to know. What Marin saw was Willa's face as she read it, and then reread it, and then set it carefully down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the surface and breathed. She looked at the card for a long time. Then she looked at Colt, who had been sitting at the edge of the kitchen since Willa arrived, watching her. She said, "How long did you say he sat under that tree?" Marin said, "Every evening, since before we moved here. 11 years, the neighbors think." Willa looked at Colt. She said, "He waited until someone was here who could find it." Nobody answered her, because there was no answer to give that would be fully adequate. And some things are better served by silence than by the inadequate thing. What Willa said next was not directed at anyone in the room. She said, "I heard you." Later, Marin would try to describe this story to people she trusted and find that certain parts of it resisted language in ways she had not anticipated. The behavior of the dog she could describe. The digging she could describe. The box and its contents and the combination and the card she could describe, more or less working around the edges of Willa's privacy. The fact that a man had apparently sealed a letter to his daughter, buried it beneath the tree where he spent every quiet evening of the last years of his life, and died before he was able to give it to her, and that his dog had then sat above that spot every evening for 11 years and had then, in what the vet they consulted would later describe as a behavior she had never personally observed and could not fully account for, begun systematically digging toward it. All of that Marin could describe. What she could not fully describe was Willa's face as she read the card. What she could not fully describe was the way Colt had watched Willa from the kitchen doorway, still and calm, and with a quality of attention that the word watchful does not fully capture. What she could not fully describe was the sense, which she acknowledged was not empirically supported and was nevertheless genuine, that the 11 years of sitting and the weeks of digging had been less about the box and more about the moment. Not just finding the thing, but choosing the moment when finding it might mean something. When there was someone in the house who would understand why finding it mattered. She knew that was not a rational thing to believe about a dog. She held it anyway. 3 months after that Saturday, Willa began coming back to the property on Callaway Road. Not to live, not yet, but on weekends and then more often. She said she was cleaning it up, resetting things. But Harriet, who watched from her kitchen window with the fluency of decades, said it looked less like cleaning and more like relearning. Like someone walking rooms they had not allowed themselves to walk in a very long time. Colt still sat under the oak every evening, but he did not sit alone anymore. Willa would bring a chair from the shed, the same folding chair her father had kept there, and she would sit beside the dog as the light left the sky, and neither of them moved until dark came fully in. Harriet mentioned this to Marin in passing, the way she mentioned most things. She said she had watched it 3 evenings in a row, and each time it was the same. The woman and the dog. The oak, the dying light. She said it was the most reliably moving thing she had ever witnessed. Marin thought about what Reed must have seen every evening in those years, sitting in that spot, with the box buried a foot below the surface, and his daughter 4 hours north. The distance between them measured not in miles, but in a silence he could not figure out how to break while he was alive. She thought about a dog who sat in the same place for 11 years, and what that was, and whether the word for it was grief or love, or whether those were the same word, said differently. That evening, when the light began to fail, she watched Colt walk across the yard and settle into the corner beneath the oak. She watched him face east of north and become still, the way he always became still. For a while, she stood at the window and watched him. Then she put on her coat and walked out to the yard and sat down in the grass beside him, not because she expected anything, but because some things deserve a witness. The light went slowly. The oak held its shape against the gray of the sky. The dog sat the way he always sat, present and patient, and directed towards something she could not see. And when the dark finally came, Marin realized she had been sitting there for over an hour without once thinking about leaving. She thought about Reed Calloway putting a letter in a metal box and sealing it and burying it in the dark under this tree and choosing this tree, and sitting above it in the evenings and dying here, and leaving behind a dog that apparently understood something about the letter's intended destination that no one else had recognized yet. She thought about Willa opening the card and pressing her palms flat on the table and breathing. She thought about the word heard. I heard you. And when Colt finally stood and walked back to the porch, she stayed in the grass for another minute in the silence he left behind. The hole had been filled in and covered over. The tree was the same tree it had always been. The evening was the same evening it had always been. But underneath everything, in the quiet particular way of all the things that last, something had moved.